Hey girl, Marissa here. You are listening to the Codependummy podcast. As a young woman, you have been raised, reinforced, and rewarded for putting the needs of others above your own. That is, for being codependent. Now in your 20s, you're exhausted, exasperated, and enveloped in crap relationships, especially the one you have with yourself. This podcast is to help you undo all that so you can stop playing small and start taking up space, you dummy. Let's get to it. Hey. I am beyond excited for you guys to hear this interview with Katie Vernoy about Sacrificial Helping Syndrome, OMG. Stay tuned till the end of the episode for 3 announcements. I will see you guys then. Enjoy. All right, today we have Katie Vernoy. She is a licensed marriage and family therapist with a master's degree in clinical psychology from Cal State Fullerton, me too, and a bachelor's in psychology and theater from Occidental College in Los Angeles. Me too. No, I'm kidding. Okay.
That would just be too weird.
Yes. Katie's experience spans many leadership and management roles in the mental health field, including the past president of the California Association of Marriage and Family Therapists. Now in business for herself, Katie provides therapy, consultation, or business strategy to support leaders, visionaries, and helping professionals in pursuing their mission to help others. Katie is also the co-founder and co-host for the Therapy Reimagined Conference and the Modern Therapist Survival Guide podcast. Katie, thank you for coming on.
Thanks for inviting me.
So, Katie is here, everybody. I will give you a hint to talk about Sacrificial Helping Syndrome, which we're going to get into. But before that, I want to try and build a bridge, see if it connects with codependency. So, first question, Katie, how do you define codependency?
I don't really have a good definition. I have to admit, I feel like codependency has been something that was in some ways created from the 12-step community, Codependents Anonymous and, those kinds of things. And it always was this thing that I always felt like I kind of knew what they meant and I never really knew what they meant. And I think I then just made sacrificial helping as kind of my version of codependency. But let me answer your question and then we can get into sacrificial helping.
Okay.
So codependency, I feel like there is in the word, it's that you're dependent on each other. And for me, I think, and this is interesting because I'm just thinking out loud, and I apologize to your listeners. I just think out loud, and sometimes it makes sense and sometimes it doesn't. But when I think about codependency and kind of the Western society that very much values independence, it's kind of this thing where, like, well, you depend on someone else for your self-worth. You depend on someone else to make you feel better. You can't really on your own do those things for yourself.
Right.
And the relationship, the truly codependent relationships are you do that for each other. So there's not really this other, it's us. And it becomes very enmeshed. It can be, a lot of different words. Now, independence is problematic in that oftentimes people will then be by themselves. And I'm going to do it my own. I'm not, who cares what anybody else thinks? I'm going to be powerful. I'm going to be strong. And I think with that, I don't think that's exactly right either. And when I was in grad school, 40 million years ago, there was this concept that I learned about that seemed super exciting, which was interdependence.
Right.
And for me, it was like, I know I can do it myself. And I also know this person, this trusted individual has my back. And there are things that I rely on them for, but if I needed to take care of it myself, I could. And so I guess what I'm saying as far as codependency, I see that as there is a gap that you could not fill yourself that you're relying on others, and the gap is so big that you constantly feel like you're not enough.
Mhm.
So that was my off the cuff. It was not great, but then I'll go to the sacrificial helping, because I think that takes it a step further, which goes into my identity is based on how I help other people.
Right.
So that's the bridge, because I can go more into sacrificial helping if you want, but I think for me codependency is a little bit more like a lack of identity, whereas sacrificial helping is my identity as helper.
Right. So with your spiel, right? You paint this picture very clearly of what independence looks like, what interdependence looks like, and codependence, which is you have a gap and you're relying on someone else to fill it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then with sacrificial helping syndrome, right? Can you repeat the definition?
I actually didn't define it, so I will start with a definition. How's
Let's
that
do
sound?
the definition.
Because you asked what's the bridge, and I was like, well, the bridge is the identity is helping.
Okay.
So I will define it. So sacrificial helping is when someone's identity gets completely taken up with helping others. They don't see value in themselves just being. And oftentimes, and this is something where I actually listened to Kurt's episode. So Kurt's my co-host on Modern Therapist Survival Guide. And he was talking about kind of there's that parentified child, or maybe you were talking about it too, but like that identity is very critical in creating sacrificial helping. As you grew up, what happened is that your role was to take care of other people. Potentially, it was a safety element, right? Like you were protecting your siblings, you were protecting your parents, you were mediating between your parents, whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
And so much of your value and identity and self worth came from that helping, that form of helping. And so, becoming a helping professional from that bent, and a lot of us do, I think that there was I think it was some sort of a thesis or dissertation paper that was about, kind of the percentage of therapists who are like wounded healers and have some sort of developmental trauma. And it's like 80% or something. So
Mm-hmm.
not a full on study. And so, don't quote me, but a lot of us, based on the trauma that we experience or the role that we played in our family, we decide that we get the most value, the most joy, I guess, is potentially, I don't know, meaning from helping people.
Mm-hmm.
And we do a lot of it. Sometimes it becomes very obsessive. And that is the only role we feel comfortable in. And so we sacrifice ourselves, our time, our money, we sacrifice our identity sometimes, because the role that we play, whether it's professionally, personally, or both, is this helper.
Mm-hmm.
And when we do that and we don't actually set boundaries for ourselves or take care of ourselves or those kinds of things, we are very prone to compassion fatigue, unchecked vicarious trauma, especially if we're working in like a therapist or some other, nursing, ER, where there's a lot of trauma, that unchecked vicarious trauma and burnout or moral injury. And so it
Mm-hmm.
becomes that we're bearing this burden, and I say sacrificial, some people might say murder,
Mm-hmm.
but this kind of sacrificial role that we play, we then don't interact with people as people. We are the helper and they are our burden.
Right. And often you see it in therapists, nurses, ERs,
Teachers.
teachers, right?
Yeah.
Which, again, I think if we look at common worker fields that codependents enter,
Yeah.
therapists, nurses, teachers.
Sure.
Mm, can you give us a concrete example from your own life where you were a sacrificial helper?
Just one?
Just, yeah, like a moment, right?
A
I know
moment.
we speak about therapists, we speak about nurses, but when's like an objective, like, okay, this is This is Katie being a
Mm.
sacrificial helper. Commercial.
uh, Let me think of a specific example. When I was working in community mental health, I did the therapist role, and I did, like what I think you had talked about this on our podcast actually, but also, and I think you've talked about it on this podcast as well, just kind of that grinding it out, tons of cases, a lot of requirements because it's public mental health, community mental health, and there's a lot of things that you are required to do or requested to do that are way more than what would fit in a 40-hour work week. So I had that experience, but I also moved up in that field, and I was a supervisor, a coordinator, and a director. And what I found is the system itself, and I think this is true in a lot of systems. And so, I know that you've got your field is a lot more kind of the younger women who are trying to get ahead of this early. So I'm going to try to make it apply because I feel like it does, but let me know if I get totally out in left field.
Okay.
But the systems that are the social systems, so medicine, med- medical and mental health care, education, a lot of those things that have become fairly feminized. So women make up between 65 and 88% of mental health professions.
Wow.
I'm sure teachers are fairly similar, and I'm sure nurses and more doctors are fairly similar. And as a profession becomes feminized, there is a perceived value that is less from other people, from other
Mm-hmm.
professions. And so there's studies done that when a profession becomes feminized, the average pay goes down.
Right.
Nothing new. We know that there's a glass ceiling. We know that women get paid less for the same work as men. Okay, whatever. But the professions themselves, even the men within those professions, are paid less than men in other kind of equivalent fields. And so what often happens, there's also less funding that goes to these things, and so then they are less funded. And so people think, well, we should have this stuff. We need medical care, we need education, we need mental health care, we need all of these things, so we should just get them because they are an entitlement, right?
Mm-hmm.
And yet people don't want to pay for them. And so who actually carries the load of that?
Right.
Of having these professions where there's not enough money in them. It's oftentimes the frontline workers. So very long way around too. Most of us go into these professions and stay in them because we feel like our mission, the thing that we're trying to do, is so important. Oftentimes life or death, maybe about the future, especially when we're looking at education. Like these are things that are so meaningful and important that
Mm-hmm.
we are willing to take less pay, crappy hours, a lot of after hours preparation. I have teachers in my family, and they spend their workday doing work with their students and then hours outside doing grading and prep and all that kind of stuff, as though
Right.
that's like, oh, that's just what you have to do, right? And so I think for me, the way that I got caught in that is that I ended up actually in management overseeing people who I was worried they were being underpaid. I
Mm-hmm.
was being underpaid. And yet there was this big mission that I felt that compelled to do. So I was working probably 80, 90-hour weeks. My
Wow.
clinicians were working those level of hours,
Right.
and we were going out into, some fine neighborhoods, but also some dangerous neighborhoods in an inner
Mm-hmm.
city. And I felt the weight of their sacrifice as well as my own sacrifice, where I felt like, even I think somebody that I was talking to was like, you would wake up feeling like you're behind. And it's like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, there's no way to catch up. There's no way to get things done. And I just kept pushing and pushing and pushing, trying to make it make sense, trying to help other people. Like I was bringing other people along with me. Like I was like, hey, other codependents, come along. Let's all do this thing.
Right.
And it felt horrible. And I actually, I say I ejected from the community mental health system, but honestly, I couldn't do it anymore. I was completely burnt out. I was trying to do what they were telling me to do, but it didn't make sense to me. And there was also all these folks who were reporting to me who I couldn't get a good relationship with because I was a mess.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, that was when I ejected and I was like, okay, this, like, I can't keep trying to be the manager, the supervisor, the employee that they want me to be. I can't do this much work. Like, it's not reasonable for a single person to do this work, much less 5 people.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm one of those people that after, I left, they hired more than one person to fill the job. Like, it's like, okay, couldn't you have just gotten me some help?
Right.
you know? And so for me, I took a couple of months, had started my private practice already and just was kind of slowly trying to rebuild. But in truth, I had lost myself. I didn't know who I was supposed to be,
Mm-hmm.
what I was supposed to be bringing to the world. And I was just kind of this, you know, I had no one to to do anything for but myself and my husband. Like, it was like, I'm just going like, what do I want to be when I grow up? And this was like 8 years ago. So I think it's something where for me, I don't know if it was completely codependence or completely sacrificial helping. That's just kind of how I've conceptualized the parts that I felt that were most toxic to me.
Right.
But I certainly went down a rabbit hole and found myself in a place where I had lost my own identity and was doing the
Mm-hmm.
things that I thought I should do to be, the good employee, the helpful boss. Like, I didn't know what I wanted anymore. And so
Mm-hmm.
it was fortunate that I was ejected from that system because I'm definitely doing things that are way better for myself now.
Right. You woke up feeling behind.
Yes, yes, I won't take credit for that. Someone else said that to me recently, and I was like, oh my gosh, that's exactly how I felt all the
Right.
time.
All the time. And so, right, you identified as a helper. You had this mission and you worked your butt off to fulfill said mission, said role. And it led to you burning out,
Yes.
being ejected,
Mm-hmm.
thankfully.
Yes, that was actually fairly lucky on my part, but it felt horrible at the time.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, no. Who wants to? Right? You said like, what do I want to be when I grow up? This right. So trying to build this bridge with codependency, you talk about this gap, right? That we're trying to fulfill with someone, and
Yes.
at least for you, maybe trying to connect it, your gap was filled with others you were helping, right? To fill.
Yeah. Or my work as a helper.
Mm-hmm. Expand on that.
Well, I think for me, when I moved away from direct client services, so I wasn't acting as a therapist for probably the last several years of my work in public mental health. There was some, I think, reliance on my supervisees or the people who were reporting to me, but in truth, it was I had created such an identity around being a helper, doing this work, that I think I was codependent with that identity or reliant on that identity and seeing myself in any other way. And the way this shows up is I wasn't setting limits in the same way that I would in normal life. I wasn't setting standards for myself. Like, yeah, I would try to negotiate higher pay. And I was actually not paid horribly, but it still was for the work I was doing, I was underpaid. But but a lot of the things I was doing was so reliant on the system. So I think it was more of like a codependence on the system and a pride in I am a helper, I am a therapist, I'm in social services, I'm doing this thing, and I lost what's healthy for me. Like I was never really seriously asking that question. It was always like, oh, I'm so tired all the time, or I'm so busy all the time, or oh my goodness, I know how to do self-care, but I just don't have the time for it. Or I just don't know why I don't do it anymore. Like it was that
Mm-hmm.
where it was almost a badge of honor.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I know in my work in community mental health, I definitely was codependent AF and a sacrificial helper. What, right? You know, I hear codependent on the system, on the role, on the identity as helper, and also the humans that were involved with that, the others. What praise, what accolades, what pats on the back did you get from the system higher ups, your employees? Like, were they like, Katie, you're crazy? Or they were like, Katie, like, yeah, what kind of feedback did you get?
Well, I think for me, there was a matchup that had the system been less toxic, maybe I'd still be in it. I
Mm.
got awards for innovative best practices. I was
Wow.
promoted. I was told, you're the most understanding supervisor I've had, or, oh, you're such a great boss, or, whatever, right? Or, oh my gosh, you managed this budget so well. Or for my clients, like nobody else gets me, like you're the best therapist ever. Um, so of course all that felt good, but then also all the negative stuff felt much bigger. And so I was constantly trying to only get all this praise and accolades. And for me, the demands of the job were offset a little bit by all of those, the awards and the praise and the whatever, and the stuff that truly felt aligned with my skills and my purpose. But then there was so many needs, whether it was the caseload was too high or productivity standard was too high, when I was still a provider, or there was just so many meetings to fit in that I would just, my day would get longer and longer because I would squeeze things in. I mean, it was something where there was also, I guess, this sort of, kind of the badge of honor, I guess, again, but like of being able to do so much.
Mhm.
I was super busy and I was super productive, and people wanted me in their meeting, or they wanted me to work on the problem. And so I was like, okay, great. Like actually, no, I don't, I'll just bring lunch with me. That's fine. Okay. You know,
Mhm. Such a good helper.
I am, I am naturally a great helper
Mhm.
of other people, not myself.
Right. So, burnt out, took time to reflect, and then, like, how did you come to work on and focus on sacrificial helping syndrome? Because when you were in it, right, typically we can't see the forest for the trees. How did you come to the SHS?
Well, there's two reasons. One is I felt like I needed to have a shtick. I was doing coaching, so I was supposed to have a shtick. So that's the less altruistic way of it. In truth, what it really was is reflecting on the difference between working for a system that relied on, depended on people to be a certain way, right? Like they
Mhm.
relied on us to do extra work, to do all that stuff. And then there was also the element of penalizing the lack of overwork. So you're not good enough, you don't care about the clients enough. Like there was a lot of things that they would say that I would just take in. I mean, I at this point I see it more as like gaslighting, or whatever it was, but like,
Mhm.
you know, we have reasonable standards, and if you don't meet them, it's because you don't care enough or you're not trying hard enough, right? And so the reason I say that is I would, once I decided, because I would read a job posting in this period of reflection, and I would be exhausted reading the job posting. So it's like, okay, I'm too burned out. I can't go back to the same system. I just
Mhm.
can't. Like it was like that feeling like you were gonna puke dread when I
Wow.
would read through a job posting. And so I was like, okay, well, let me try this private practice thing. I've got this tiny little private practice. Let's bring it closer to home and see if I can make a deal of it. And so then, of course, I started working 15-hour weeks, networking and trying to meet people and create this business. So, of course, I completely overdid it the other way. But in those meetings and talking to people who were not in the profession, who were in talking with people who were not in the profession or who were doing other types of helping that were more boundaried than
Mhm.
maybe therapists, and talking with them and telling and having them say something like, "Oh my gosh, Katie, that's great insight. I'd never thought about it that way." Or, "You are really good at this, aren't you?" You know, just like random stuff. And maybe they were blowing smoke up my behind because of, you know, we're networking and we're going to be best friends, right? But it happened frequently enough where I was like, "Oh my gosh, I'm not horrible. I don't have to prove myself every single second of every single day." Like, yes,
Mhm.
there's a certain amount of entrepreneurship that you do have to prove yourself a lot, but it was different. I
Right.
was like, what was that dynamic that I was in where I had to constantly try harder, be better, help more, do more in order to feel like I was good enough? And so part of it was understanding the toxic work environment. The other thing was understanding why I would allow myself to get into that dynamic. And so I started looking at it, and I've tried to write books on it, so I've got like thousands of words and lots of research, and I started doing talks on it. And as I was reading more and more, I was like, oh, well, this is just the thing I built for my coaching business so people can understand it. And then I would read the research and I was like, oh crap. Parentified child, check.
Mhm.
Like I would go through, I'm like, oh, not only does this feel true, it actually is true based on the research.
Right.
And so for me, it was understanding that that dynamic was toxic for me. It contributed to, it was the system contributed to it or relied on it, in fact. And so I had to figure out, how do I talk to people for whom this is a true pattern where they will get it?
Mhm.
And so sacrificial helping is just what I came up with. But I think we know, viscerally, we know, and we've been those people, we've seen those people where when you truly love helping, sometimes it's so hard to turn it off, and you can become so bitter and exhausted, and your body starts screaming at you and all of those things. And so we know what it is. I
Mhm.
just put a cute little name on it.
Yeah.
But that's I think how I started realizing it was I was outside of the system so long and in such a different set of interactions, way more than I should have. And I set up my own, burnout system by giving myself so much to do. But I think for me, it was having people treat me as though I was valuable and unique just for being myself, and getting a breath from that system
Mhm.
that asked me to be different than I was and to do more than I could in order to be acceptable.
Right. You caught a breath.
I caught a breath. And I'm still working on giving that to myself, speaking of gaps. But yeah, I
Mhm.
think it helped me to get far enough away from it that I recognized how bad it was for me and how it was, kind of increasing that pattern.
Mhm. And right, for the listeners who are young women, 20s, 30s, you said it helped to be ejected, right? To look at the toxic system and how that was contributing. But you had this question like, why? Like, why did I sign up for this? Like, why did I
Allow
maintain?
myself. Yeah.
Yes. So why do people choose to sacrifice themselves over and over and over again?
Well, I think you hit on it with the rewards. I mean,
Mhm.
I think certainly people get rewarded in some ways. I think if you take it too far, then you become that horrible, toxic person that's bitter and feels like they have to do everything. So I think that eventually gets to the point where you're not rewarded. But like people that are like, oh, I can always rely on you. You're the person that I trust the most. Like when you get so much of the value of the help that you're providing, it can be very intoxicating. And you can rely on that as your personality. And so thinking of yourself, and the way I talk to some of my clients, mostly therapy clients on this, and not for a long time, but like the way I would talk about it is imagining yourself, whether it's sick or just tired or disabled or something, and sitting on a couch and not able to provide all this help, whatever it is, like unable or older, all the things that our capacity sometimes will decrease. Like if our capacity was diminished, if you could imagine yourself with a diminished capacity, would you still be lovable? Would you still have value? And yes, I acknowledge that there are things that we provide. We can provide value with the help. With the help, we can provide value with our thoughtfulness. But we just being there, sitting there, we are valuable. And I think we don't get that message. Society says we're only valuable if we're pretty, thin, perfectly able, helping, giving to others, being humble, sacrificing ourselves. There's cultures that have whole systems of sacrifice that can be helpful, but also can be very harmful if you don't hold on to yourself as an individual. And I think for myself, I became a therapist pretty early. It seems like you probably did as well. When you're trying to constantly empathize, or if you're in a position where your role is to understand the other that you're working with, and it could be having an overwhelming boss, but it could also be customer service, it could be teaching. But when the person that you serve is way more important than you, and everything is supposed to be aligned with what they need, and it could be the system or an individual or customer, client, whatever. If you've not fully developed who you are, you're spending all of your waking hours or 40 hours a week or whatever it is being somebody else.
Right.
Or reactively being the self that can serve.
Right.
And so I think, and this was the part that I think I continue to grapple with, it's truly knowing who you are separate from what you can do for other people. And maybe that's a better way than saying, well, what if you couldn't help people? But like, if it's just you and no one's asking anything from you, you don't have any role, you can't take care of anyone, who are you? I always ask this question, who are you and what are you putting out into the world on our podcast? And I think for me, that is critical. Oftentimes people talk about how they serve, right? So like it still ends up being my identity is based on how I help other people. And fair, whatever. But I think being able to understand yourself separate from your job, separate from your role, who you are as a woman, who you are as an individual, like that to me, I think can be the biggest part that keeps people in these environments, because they don't know, like, okay, I don't like this. This doesn't feel comfortable, but something else could be worse. And I have no sense of what I actually want.
Who am I? Who are you, listener?
Who are you?
Who are
we
you?
Want to know.
Right now, I know in another episode, I said something like, if I'm not in service to others, like, who am I? I had no idea. And it's an important question to ask. And if we are raised, right, and society also doesn't help, right? Because you said, society wants us to be thin, pretty. I'm like, our families too. So family, society, if we're raised to be praised for those things or reinforced, encouraged, and we identify as the family therapist, the family helper, the referee. I know I refereed, like, okay, mom, dad,
mediator,
time out.
Yep.
Right? We can just continue to play that role as students, as professionals, as spouses, as mothers, and without pausing, it could just go on ad infinitum.
Yes.
So very luckily you were ejected. I think I was dumped a couple too many times by alcoholic boyfriends, right? That
there you go.
the reflection was able to, and like, yeah, I didn't know who I was without this other to please or worry about or help.
Yeah.
Mhm. I like how you said if someone sees you as the reliable, the one and only, you understand me. It's intoxicating.
Yeah.
Codependents arguably can be addicted to that intoxication of others' approval, love.
Need.
What do we how do we embrace sobriety of that or what do we get intoxicated on after we start to realize, right? Like you said, like you realize the system, you questioned why you were there and you looked at that, you looked at your past. What do we replace that with?
I don't know that there's a single answer. I think that the things that I've done is some self reflection. Who am I and what do I want to be putting out in the world? Like, who am I as an
Mhm.
individual if I had no responsibilities, if no one was relying on me in any way, or there wasn't a strong push to do one thing or another, what would I be doing?
Mhm.
And then taking another breath and saying it again, because oftentimes there's so many pressures that we internalize those pressures, right? So we're still saying like, oh, but I still have to, but I have to remember, and like trying to get down to a very blank slate of what brings me joy. What are my areas of genius? What are the things that I do absolutely well that actually fill me up versus drain me? And so I did that reflection. But then I also recognized that there is a superpower in helping people. I mean, it's great to feel good that you're helping people. I think if it's boundaried, if you recognize that you're opting in for it and it's not this thing that you're doing because you've always done it and there's no forethought or insight around it, but like I recognize that I am more likely to follow through and to do things for myself if I also think it's in service to others. And
Mhm.
so I lean into it. You know, the pandemic has shifted some things. And so, like, I don't have a personal trainer who's relying on me to show up and to make sure that they continue to be employed. Right. So, that, okay, there's that. But, like, that's what I would recommend is like, okay, well, if you want to be able to make sure that you're getting healthy, identify what you want to be doing, see if there's someone that will meet you there. And then the two of you can, in an interdependent way, hold each other accountable and serve each other by both showing up for each other as well as yourselves.
Mhm.
Now that can devolve into, well, do you really want to? Or, oh, well, I'll do it if you do. I mean, like it can get, the dynamic can always revert, right? Of course. But I lean into the fact that I know that I'm going to show up. I'm going to do things for myself. If I plan it ahead, if I know someone's relying on me to be there, you know, I schedule things. I make sure that someone else is depending on me to be present, but I do it for my self-care.
Mhm.
So maybe that's still a little bit codependent, but
Sounds
it means that I'm getting,
interdependent.
it might be interdependent. I hope it's interdependent, but you know, there's times I'm like, you know, like this evening, my husband and I have counted on each other. We're going to go for a walk so that we both will get some activity. Now, there are times when both of us are like, I don't really want to. Do you want to? And so it doesn't work. But I know that I'm more likely to show up if I've committed to my husband that we're going to do this. And I know that both of us need this activity versus beating myself up every day that I didn't get on the treadmill or I didn't do this or that
Mhm.
because I'm relying just on myself to do things. So that's why I said, like, I like the interdependence versus the independence because I think too often we're not going to dig ourselves out of codependence or sacrificial helping because there's no benefit to other people, at least not direct benefit for us taking care of ourselves. Now we know
Mhm.
that's stupid, right? Like that's not actually true. Like if we are burning ourselves out, our bodies are screaming, we're sick all the time, we're bitter, like of course we're not helpful. People don't trust us because we overpromise and we can't deliver. I mean, like it's bad if we actually don't take care of ourselves. But in the moment, If it's like, well, I could finish this email, or I could do this project that someone else is relying on me for, or I could go work out or meditate or get some sleep or take a day off. All of the things for myself feel very selfish. So I lean
Mhm.
into the fact that I know that that's the case and try to set up some structure so that I am understanding my general tendency to sacrifice myself for others in order to not sacrifice myself all the time.
Right.
So it's not perfect, but I also know that if I would have just been like, I got to knuckle down and take care of myself, I wouldn't have done it.
Mm-mm. Right, those extremes. So
Yeah.
self-sacrifice or just
Total
totally
independence.
reliant. Yeah,
Yeah.
just
Like
neither.
self-focus. Like I am going to take care of myself because I am worth it. Like I believe that in theory.
Right.
In the moment, it feels like the most selfish thing I could do.
Mhm.
So I recognize that. That's a limitation I have.
And for the listener who maybe didn't get ejected, hasn't gotten dumped enough,
Mm-hmm.
right? She starts to set boundaries or limits, and that selfish, self-centered, lazy self-criticism starts to come up. I've talked about the long-term consequences of codependency. I'm curious what the long-term consequences are of sacrificial helping syndrome. Like what if we just keep on keeping on sacrificing?
So you could decide how much of this answer you want to keep in. The long-term impacts of sacrificial helping can be fairly mild, just really unhealthy, mildly unsatisfied with your life, and potentially a shorter lifespan because you've constantly sacrificed your health for everyone else. Now, if we're looking at the levels at which people are actually really worried about, I mentioned not being trusted. So when we can't say no, we promise and commit to everyone, and we keep giving and giving and giving. If I promise to 3 people that I'm going to do something, and I really only have the bandwidth to do something for one of those people, I will either let all 3 of them down or at least let 2 of them down.
Mhm.
And then they'll stop trusting me. And then they'll start treating me differently, and I'll feel differently. And don't they realize how much I'm sacrificing just to help them out? And they should just accept the help that I have to give, and blah, blah, blah. And there's bitterness, and then there's isolation. Potentially you get ejected, but you continue to kind of find your way back into the same system. Or it
Right.
could be you get broken up with or whatever. Like you could have that where you keep coming back because you're not recognizing that the dynamic is your willingness to sacrifice your own needs, and not the dynamic is just you're hanging out with assholes.
Right.
I think they're not mutually exclusive. I'll just say that. And so to me, there are times when the truly awful long term effects of sacrificial helping can be severe depression,
Mhm.
suicide,
Mhm.
it can be severe anxiety. It can be completely ejecting from a profession that you absolutely adore because you have nothing left to give. And so you end up completely unfulfilled, and also very negative, very, self judgment, because of not being able to do what you thought you could do. And so for me, I think when I start thinking about, okay, I'm going down this road and I'm starting to see these things come up and I'm starting to lose my way, and I'm not getting ejected and I'm getting rewarded and all of these things, it's like I need to take a pause. I need to think and see if I can get clear on, is this toxic or is this okay? Is this what I want or is this what everybody else wants for me? And then try to kind of build up that resilience to say, let me just try setting some limits here. Worst case, I decide to stop setting those limits, or I decide to stop doing these things. But what
Mhm.
happens if I set some of these limits, if I do some of these things? And then I try to remind myself of what is at stake. If I don't, I won't be able to do this at all. I won't be able to sustain this. So I
Mhm.
have to figure out something different. So I don't know if that's like in the moment, what can you do? But I think the consequences could be pretty bad
Right.
if you don't pull yourself out of truly sacrificial helping. You can help people. You can be generous. You can be humble. You can do all of those things, but we can't forget who we are and what we need. It's, it's the oxygen mask. You have to put on your oxygen mask before someone else's.
Mm-hmm.
Like we can't pour out of an empty pitcher. We have to refill.
Right. That does sound in the moment and also long term. Everybody, you said pause, think, like ask, like, how is this feeling? Is this what I want? Is this what they want? Experiment with setting some limits. You can always take them back if they don't feel good. But, and then reminding yourself, like, what is at stake? And Katie, it is, I think, with codependency and sacrificial helping syndrome, which just seem to be part of the braid with other martyrdom and
Yes.
other things,
Yes.
right? It's these small moments. Of course, they contribute and the consequences lead to big things, but it's these tiny choices, right? This enabling, this boundary crossing, this, okay, let me do it, just building up. And so pause, think, set limits, remind yourself what's at stake.
And I've got one more question for your audience to ask themselves. Who would you be if you were not afraid?
Mm-hmm.
Because so much of this fear of not being accepted, not being loved, not doing enough, being selfish, like if we could just pull back the fear, we can identify who am I without all this other noise.
Mm-hmm. Who
So
would you be?
if you weren't afraid?
Mm-hmm. All right, mic drop. We will end with that, listeners. Be very introspective this week. And if you're asking these questions and want help answering them with Katie, where can people find you?
Well, they can certainly find me on my website, katievernoy.com. And I know you also work with folks on these things. So I think you're definitely a good resource. But if people are specifically wanting to talk about their careers, especially if they're thinking about leadership and wanting to make sure that they're a conscious leader stepping into leadership versus kind of a codependent or sacrificial leader,
Mm-hmm.
I did put together an offer for your audience. So I think it's $150 off a strategy session. It's like a 2-hour strategy
Wow.
session where we dig in, do a whole assessment of your career and all that kind of stuff. And so it's a very special one. I put a page together, so hopefully people will head over to your show notes to see how everything is capitalized and not, because it's title case, just so people know, but it's a bit.ly and it's / own your career - codependummy. So
Wow. And they can literally ask and answer, who am I? What am I putting into the world? Who would I
what would I
be?
do if I wasn't afraid?
Yeah, I love it. Well, thank you so much. We will definitely put that in the show notes. And also check out Katie's podcast. If you're a therapist, the conference, Katie changed my life. Y'all don't know this,
Aw.
but you did. And I say that on the episode I was with you guys with, hopefully. Talk about you all the time.
Aw.
So thank you. Thank you for coming on.
Absolutely. Thank you for inviting me. This was awesome.
Wowza, was that good podcast? 2 announcements for everybody. First, congrats to Becky Nagel. She is the winner of Dr. Talal Al-Salim's book drawing. He volunteered or offered to have one of the lucky listeners win a copy of his book. So congrats, Becky, and I hope some of you take advantage of Katie's special offer today. I have posted that in the show notes. Second announcement, I am going to have a part 2 to this interview and share about my own experience with sacrificial helping syndrome and how my codependency showed up at work, at one job in particular, maybe a couple jobs. So it won't be next week, That part 2 will air on Memorial Day. So just a heads up for you guys all to stay tuned. And I hope you're left with some questions and reflection about your own sacrificial helping syndrome at work, currently and or in the past. So thank you, girl, so much for listening. And until next time, always remember that if you are feeling unseen, I see you. If you are feeling unheard, I hear you. And if you think that you don't matter, know that you matter to me. I want you to go out there so you can stop playing big and start taking up space, you dummy. Take care. You're still here? Just kidding. Girl, this is not therapy and I'm not your therapist, okay? This podcast is designed to provide accurate and authoritative information in regards to the subject matter covered. It is given with the understanding that neither the host, the publisher, or the guests are rendering any legal, clinical, or other professional information. If you want or need a professional, you should find one.